England had been conquered less than 2 years earlier, and nothing in the kingdom felt settled. Not the laws, not the language, not the food served in the halls that had once belonged to Saxon kings. When Queen Matilda's coronation approached in 1068, the palace kitchens moved with a precision usually reserved for armies. Fires were stoked long before dawn. Barons and bishops argued over seating. Servants carried instructions written in a dozen hands, some in French, some in English, some in a blend of both. Coronations were not merely ceremonies. They were declarations of stability, a promise that the crown, fragile as it was, could still command order. And deep in the kitchens beneath Westminster, there was one task that no one took lightly. A single dish was being prepared for the first service of the feast. Not the largest, not the most extravagant, but the one that tradition demanded must appear before all others. The man responsible for it was a Norman cook named Tezelin. He had crossed the Channel with William's army, and unlike the warriors who now stood guard in the abbey, his weapon was a wooden ladle and the ability to transform whatever he was given into something worthy of a royal table. Whatever Tezelin was stirring that morning, it was important enough to have its own place in the procession of officers, stewards, and ceremonial bearers. Important enough that the king himself would acknowledge it. But what the chroniclers found most remarkable was not the dish itself. It was what that single act in the kitchen would set into motion, an obligation, a reward, and a mystery that England would spend generations trying to unravel. The coronation of Matilda was meant to calm a kingdom still shifting under Norman rule. William had taken the crown by force, and every shire felt the aftershocks. Castles rose on hills where none had stood before. Sheriffs were replaced, laws were rewritten. Even the language spoken in court had changed. To the Normans, the coronation was not simply a celebration, it was a demonstration that their rule was legitimate, rooted, and blessed. Every detail of the event mattered: the order of the procession, the instruments used in the anointing, the placement of nobles at the feast. Nothing could appear improvised. And this is why the kitchens worked with such discipline. If the feast faltered, the message faltered with it. The first dish of the banquet held a place of symbolic importance. Medieval chroniclers describe it not as the most elaborate plate, but as the one that set the tone for the rest of the feast. Its arrival signaled that order had been established in the whole. Tezelin's task was not simply to cook, it was to ensure that the ceremony began with precision. But the records from the period leave an unusual silence around the nature of this dish. They note its presence, they mention its placement, they describe the officer who carried it, yet for the moment, none of them explain what exactly it was. This omission wouldn't matter for most dishes, but this one would be different. Because what Tezelin prepared that day would not end with the coronation, it would start a tradition that England would struggle to interpret for centuries. After the coronation feast concluded, William granted rewards to those who had served him well. Some earned gold, some gained a place in the royal household, and some received land, the truest currency of medieval power. Among the recipients was Tezelin, the cook responsible for that very first dish. The chroniclers record that he was awarded the Manor of Addington, not a token gift, not a gesture of courtesy, a full manor with tenants, fields, woodland, and steady income. For a man whose life had been spent near hearths and chopping blocks, it was a transformation as dramatic as any the new regime produced. But the manor came with a condition. Tezelin's family would be required to produce the same dish at every future coronation. Not for a decade, not for a single dynasty, for as long as there were English monarchs. This type of obligation had a name: serjeanty. Sergenties were rare grants of land tied to very specific duties. One family might hold land in exchange for carrying the king's banner into battle. Another might be responsible for maintaining a particular bridge. One held land for the task of presenting a glove during coronation ceremonies. These duties did not expire. They passed from parent to child as predictably as the land itself. Tezelin's Sergeanty was simple in wording, but complicated in practice. Produce the same dish at each coronation. Yet even in Tezelin's own lifetime, England shifted so quickly that the identity of the dish would soon begin to blur. And what happened next was unlike any other Sergeanty in the kingdom. Where other duties remained clear, this one drifted into doubt. If Tezelin had written down his recipe, the story might have ended simply. But he didn't, or if he did, the document has never surfaced. So later generations attempted to preserve the tradition through memory and scattered notes. And this is where the confusion began. Across royal records, household accounts, and coronation rolls from the 12th to the 17th century, the dish appears under names that barely resemble each other. Diligraud, Dilegraud, Diligrave, Diligru, Gyrant, Mulpigent, Bardigroot, Bardolph. The spellings changed, the sounds changed, even the structure of the word changed. In some accounts, the dish was thick. In others, it was thin. Some described a sweet pottage, others spoke of something savory and heavy with meat. This was not a case of inconsistent spelling, which was normal in the Middle Ages. This was a case of the dish itself drifting into uncertainty. The only constant was the obligation. The Lord of Addington must present the dish, whatever it was understood to be at the time. By the 14th century, officials charged with preparing coronations were already expressing confusion. Some documents describe the dish with two different names in the same breath, as if attempting to guess which version was correct. And so the dish became a paradox, an unbroken tradition whose identity kept changing, a royal obligation that England upheld even as no one could quite explain what it referred to. Nearly 350 years after Matilda's coronation, a manuscript compiled around 1425 offered the first substantial clue. Among its recipes was a dish labeled Bardolph. The name caught historians' attention for one reason. Around this time, the manor of Addington was held by the Baron Bardolph, a descendant of the original family tied to the coronation dish. The connection was too strong to ignore. The recipe described almond milk cooked with sweet wine, capon meat pounded to a paste, a blend of cloves, ginger, and mace, pine nuts, and a final addition of vinegar tempered with ginger powder and a splash of rose water added off the fire. The result was a thick, luxurious pottage, unmistakably a dish worthy of a coronation table. This did not prove the recipe was the original, but it aligned with fragments from earlier coronation accounts: sweetness, spice, almond richness, and poultry. The manuscript also revealed something else. The dish may have been tied not to a flavor profile, but to a lineage. Instead of naming the dish by its ingredients, the scribe named it after the man obligated to prepare it. Bardolph was not a culinary category, it was a duty made edible. This explains why the dish's names drifted so widely. Scribes were not describing a standardized recipe, they were capturing a tradition rooted in obligation, not taste. Even with the 1425 manuscript, the identity remained partly obscured. But for the first time in centuries, the fog around Tezelin's dish began to thin. While the recipe changed across centuries, the ritual surrounding it remained remarkably stable. Coronation banquet records, especially those from the 12th to the 15th centuries, describe the procession of dishes with meticulous detail. The structure was consistent. The officers of the kitchen entered first, followed by the silver scullery, then the newly made knights of the bath, then high stewards, and finally the representative of the Manor of Addington. His role was distinct. He alone carried the coronation dish. It was placed before the king with formal acknowledgement. A second portion went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, a third to whomever the king chose. It did not matter if the king ate it. It did not matter if he recognized its ingredients. The presence of the dish fulfilled the legal and symbolic requirement. The Steward of Addington walked in coronations for the Angevin kings, the Plantagenets, the Lancastrians, the Yorkists, the Tudors, and the early Stuarts. Through wars, plagues, dynastic collapses, and shifts in political power, the tradition persisted. The royal court changed languages and fashions. Banquets grew more elaborate, some featuring hundreds or even thousands of dishes. But one item on the table was older than most of the nobility present. A dish that no one could quite define, yet everyone recognized as part of the structure of English coronation. Its meaning was buried under centuries of repetition. Its purpose was preserved only because the contract that created it never expired. By the 17th century, the dish had become an anachronism. English tastes had changed. Medieval sweetness gave way to lighter, sharper flavors. Almond milk declined in prestige. Spices, once rare, were now common. At the coronation of Charles II in 1661, the Steward of Addington carried the dish forward as tradition required. The Lord Chancellor acknowledged it. The King did not touch it. Worse, for the dish's prestige, coronation feasts of the era had become spectacles of scale. James II's banquet in 1685 included more than 1,400 dishes, an avalanche of meats, pastries, molded sugarworks, and sculpted displays meant to overwhelm the senses. In that environment, the ancient pottage felt out of place. It was not elegant, not theatrical, not fashionable. But it marched into the hall all the same. A relic no one dared remove, a dish whose presence mattered even when its flavor did not. The obligation persisted because the legal condition persisted. As long as Addington was bound to the dish, and as long as England crowned kings, the dish would appear. Its purpose had shifted from nourishment to symbol, a sign of continuity older than the monarchy's own dynastic lines. And that, ironically, is what ensured it lasted longer than most dishes ever named in royal menus. The coronation of George IV in 1821 marked the final chapter of the dish's ceremonial life. By then, England had industrialized. Royal banquets were losing their medieval character, and the sergeanties that once defined feudal obligations were being phased out or absorbed into modern legal structures. Still, the tradition called for the dish to appear once more. The Steward of Addington fulfilled the duty, presenting the bowl as generations had done before him. But contemporary accounts show little interest in it. Newspapers covering the coronation mentioned the spectacle of uniforms, jewels, and orchestras, but barely noted the ancient dish. It had become a formality, preserved only because no one had yet written the words that would release Addington from its centuries-old burden. Soon after George IV's coronation, reforms to feudal tenures finally dissolved many hereditary obligations. The Addington sergeantry faded with them. The dish vanished from the record. The recipe had already dissolved long before. The names had drifted apart. The meaning had thinned to a thread. What survived until 1821 was not the dish, but the duty. Once that duty ended, the dish simply dissolved into history, a tradition that had lasted nearly 8 centuries, carried by dozens of coronations, countless scribes, and generations of cooks, disappeared almost quietly. But the confusion remained, because England was left with the puzzle of a dish that existed everywhere in its ceremonial memory and nowhere in its certainty. The full strangeness of the story becomes clear only when all its parts are viewed together. Unlike most medieval dishes, this one was tied to a legal obligation, preserved in ceremony rather than cuisine, recorded by scribes who rarely tasted it, described differently in each century, named after the families who held the duty, and reconstructed only in fragments. This unusual combination meant the dish was preserved without clarity. Traditions typically survive because they are repeated with consistency. This tradition survived because it only required appearance, not accuracy. The steward of Addington had to bring a dish, but no one had authority to define the dish. As a result, scribes wrote down what they thought it was, cooks improvised based on whatever version they inherited, chroniclers copied earlier mistakes, and each coronation added a new variation to the chain. Even the 1425 manuscript, the closest we have to a recipe, represents only one moment in that evolving tradition. The confusion, therefore, was not a failure of memory. It was an inevitable outcome of the dish's role, a culinary obligation detached from a culinary standard, which is why your title is historically precise. England did not misunderstand the dish once. It misunderstood it repeatedly, generation after generation, because the obligation endured while the knowledge that defined it dissolved. The dish lived longer than its own identity. No modern kitchen can recreate Tezelin's dish with certainty. The ingredients can be assembled, the spices measured, the almond whelk thickened, but the essence is missing, because the essence was never flavor. The dish began as a gesture of loyalty in 1068. It survived as a legal bond. It drifted through centuries as a tradition without definition. And it ended not when its recipe disappeared, but when its obligation finally dissolved. For nearly 800 years, it stood at the edge of every English coronation, a reminder of the first moment Norman rule settled onto the English throne. Today, all that remains is a tangle of names, a handful of manuscripts, and the record of a manor granted to a cook who likely never imagined the weight of what he stirred into his pot. England remembers the conquerors, the kings, the battles, the crowns. But tucked beneath all of that is a stranger legacy, a dish that outlasted dynasties, a tradition carried by families who never tasted the original, and a recipe so fragmented that it became one of the longest-running puzzles in English ceremonial history. A cook earned a manor for one stew. And for the next 700 years, England tried to remember what exactly he had made.